My name is Daniel, and I never thought I'd be sharing this story. But after what I experienced during my death, I realize I have no choice. If I stay silent, I betray everything I was shown. If I speak, I risk being called crazy. But the truth is more important than my reputation, and if there's even a chance that someone out there needs to hear this, then I have to tell it. It was an ordinary evening, or at least, it started that way. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the slick roads gleamed under the dim glow of streetlights. I had just finished a long shift, the kind that wears on your soul as much as your body. I was exhausted, my mind running on autopilot, thinking only of getting home to my wife and son. Maybe I'd grab a bite to eat, kiss them goodnight, and collapse into bed. That was the plan. The road stretched ahead of me, empty except for the occasional flash of headlights in the distance. My eyelids were heavy and I blinked hard, rolling down the window to let the cold night air slap me awake. The hum of the tires against wet pavement filled the silence of my car. I remember checking the dashboard clock, 10:47 p.m. Just a few more minutes and I'd be home. Then everything changed. A flash of movement, headlights, too close, too fast. The screech of tires, the deafening crunch of metal against metal. My world exploded into chaos. The seatbelt yanked me back as my car spun, the force wrenching my body in ways it wasn't meant to move. Glass shattered. Something struck my head. Then silence, not just quiet, absolute, all-consuming silence. At first I thought I was unconscious, but then I realized I was still aware. A strange sensation washed over me as if I were floating, weightless and free. The pain was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. I opened my eyes, or maybe I just saw, because I wasn't sure if I even had a body anymore. Below me, the wreckage of my car lay twisted and broken, smoke curling into the night. My own body slumped motionless against the deflated airbag, blood trickling from my temple. People were gathering, their voices muffled as if I were hearing them from underwater. Someone screamed for help. A man was dialing his phone, his hands shaking. I should have felt panic. I should have fought to wake up, to move, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a pull, gentle, insistent. It was as if an invisible force was guiding me upward, away from the broken body that had once been mine. Then the light appeared. It wasn't just a light. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling me, pulling me toward it. It wasn't blinding, yet I couldn't look away. It was warm, familiar, and as I moved closer, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. A voice, clear and powerful, yet somehow gentle, spoke. It wasn't in words exactly, but I understood. It is not yet your time. The moment I heard it, my soul trembled with recognition. The voice carried authority beyond anything I had ever known, yet it was filled with love. A love so overwhelming, so pure that it undid me. I tried to speak, but I had no mouth. I tried to move, but I had no form. And yet I was still me. The light shifted and suddenly I was standing, or at least I felt like I was standing on the edge of a vast space. It stretched endlessly in all directions, not empty but full. Full of something unseen yet deeply felt, like a presence pressing against my very being. Then he stepped forward. I don't have the words to describe him, not fully. Every word I can think of is too small, too inadequate, but I knew him. Even before he spoke, I knew Jesus. He didn't look like the paintings, yet he was unmistakable. His presence was overwhelming, his gaze piercing yet filled with infinite compassion. His very being radiated a love so intense it felt like it could shatter me. I fell, if falling was even possible in that place. It wasn't just awe. It was an instinct, a response to something so holy, so beyond me that I couldn't do anything else. "Rise," he said, and the word itself lifted me. I wanted to speak, to ask, to weep. But before I could, he raised a hand and the space around us changed. The peace I had felt was suddenly replaced by something else, something heavy, dark. And then I saw it, a war. It wasn't a battle of flesh and blood. not the kind you see in movies or read about in history books. This was different, deeper. Shadows moved against light, forces clashing with an intensity beyond anything on Earth. It wasn't chaos, it was precise, strategic. I saw figures, some beautiful, radiant, wielding light itself as a weapon. Others twisted, cloaked in darkness, moving with a malice that sent chills through my soul. I understood without being told that this war had been raging since before time began, and it was still raging now. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow and urgency. "This is the battle you do not see," he said, "but it is the battle that decides everything." I wanted to turn away, to deny what I was seeing, but I couldn't, because I knew deep down that it was true. The world as we knew it wasn't just flesh and blood, politics and technology, wars and progress. There was something deeper, something hidden. A battle that had been influencing everything from the very beginning, and then Jesus showed me what was coming. The vision shifted, and suddenly, I wasn't just watching the battle. I was inside it, not as a warrior, not as a fighter, but as an observer. And yet I could feel everything. The weight of it, the terror, the urgency. I saw cities towering and bright, full of life. People going about their days, laughing, working, scrolling through their screens, completely unaware of what lurked just beyond their perception. Above them, unseen to human eyes, forces of darkness moved like shadows, whispering, twisting, deceiving. I saw them plant thoughts in people's minds, subtle lies, little temptations, slow compromises. They didn't shout or force, they nudged, they suggested, they made wrong feel reasonable, harmless. And people listened. But there were others too. Figures of light, warriors standing guard, fighting to shield and awaken those who would listen. They moved with strength and purpose, but they were outnumbered. I could see it. The battle was tipping. The deception was growing. Then I saw what was coming. The world changed before my eyes. The cities remained, but they felt different, familiar yet hollow. The laughter was forced, the joy synthetic. It looked like life, but something was missing, and then I realized faith. It was fading. Not all at once, but bit by bit, until it was almost gone. People still went to churches, still called themselves believers, but it was different. Their faith was diluted, mixed with things that had no place in it. The words were the same, but the meaning had changed. It was softer, more comfortable. It didn't challenge, didn't convict. And worst of all, it no longer held power. I saw churches bowing to the culture instead of standing against it. I saw truth twisted until it was unrecognizable. I saw people worshiping not God but themselves, wrapped in spirituality that promised enlightenment but left them empty. And above it all, I saw the darkness laughing. Jesus stood beside me, his face sorrowful. "Do you see?" he asked. I could barely breathe. "How?" I whispered. "How did it get like this?" He looked at me, and in that moment I understood something deep in my soul. It didn't happen overnight. It was slow, calculated. The enemy didn't need to destroy faith outright. He just needed to water it down, to make it comfortable, convenient, harmless. And we let it happen. I felt a weight in my chest, something heavy and inescapable. This wasn't just a vision of possibility. It was happening now. I had seen glimpses of it in my own life, but I had ignored them. The subtle compromises, the small distractions, the way truth had started to feel like an opinion rather than an absolute. Jesus spoke again. "The greatest deception is not in what is seen, but in what is unseen." Then he showed me more, a future beyond the present. A world where faith was nothing more than a relic of the past, where people believed in their own power, their own wisdom, their own ability to shape truth, where right and wrong were no longer fixed but fluid, changing with the times, bending to the will of the majority. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that many who once believed never even noticed they had drifted. I saw faces, pastors, leaders, believers, people who had once stood strong, now barely recognizable. Not because they had renounced faith, but because they had reshaped it into something unoffensive, something marketable. They had convinced themselves they were still walking the right path, even as they drifted further and further from it. And I saw others, those who had stayed true, being silenced, mocked, cast out as relics of a bygone era. The deception coming is greater than you can imagine, Jesus said. Even the faithful will be tested. His words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to argue, to say it couldn't be that bad. That people would wake up, that believers would fight back, but deep down I knew it was already happening. I turned to Jesus, desperation clawing at me. What do I do? His eyes met mine, filled with both love and urgency. You must tell them. I felt panic rise in me. Tell them. Who would believe me? The look in his eyes stopped me. I was about to say I was just an ordinary man, but I realized that didn't matter. This wasn't about me. This is why you must return, he said. I didn't want to. Everything in me longed to stay in that place, to remain in the presence of the one who was truth itself. But I knew he was right. The battle wasn't coming. It was already here. And if people didn't wake up, they wouldn't even realize they had lost. A sudden force pulled me backward. The vision blurred, the light faded. I tried to hold on, tried to stay, but it was too late. The physical world was calling me back, and then pain, blinding, crushing pain. My lungs burned, my body ached, and I gasped, choking on the taste of blood and hospital air. A cacophony of sounds crashed into me, machines beeping, voices shouting, hands pressing against my chest. I was back, but I wasn't the same. The moment I opened my eyes, I knew. I wasn't just waking up. I was returning with something I could never unsee, never unfeel. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavier than my own broken body. My chest burned with every breath, my ribs ached, and the steady beeping of monitors filled the room. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, harsh and artificial compared to the brilliance I had just left behind. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had died. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. Voices swam around me, muffled and distant at first, then clearer. A woman gasping. A man shouting for the doctor, footsteps rushing toward me, hands gripping my arm, checking my pulse. I turned my head, too fast, sending a sharp pain through my skull, and saw my wife, Sarah. Her face was pale, eyes wide with shock, lips trembling as she whispered my name. Daniel. The sound of her voice anchored me, pulling me fully into the physical world. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, my voice barely a croak. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she clutched my hand, pressing it to her face. You were gone, she sobbed. They said you were gone. I didn't know how to respond. How could I tell her that she was right? That I had died, that I had seen something beyond this world, that I had spoken with Jesus himself. The doctors came in then, bustling around me, checking my vitals, speaking in rushed tones. A miracle, they called it. My heart had stopped for nearly 6 minutes, no brain activity, no signs of life. And yet here I was, awake, alive. But I wasn't the same man I had been before. I could still hear his voice in my mind, tell them. But how, lying in that hospital bed, I realized something chilling. I had seen the battle, the deception, the slow unraveling of truth. But the most terrifying part, it had already begun, and I was returning to a world that wouldn't want to hear it. The days that followed were a blur of recovery, tests, physical therapy, reporters wanting to hear the miracle story of the man who had come back from the dead. My story spread quickly, but they only wanted the surface-level details. The near-death experience, the bright light, the sensation of peace. People ate that up. But the moment I spoke about what I had seen, the moment I mentioned the war in the spirit world, the deception that was already here. Silence. No one wanted to hear it. At first I thought it was just discomfort, that people didn't know how to process something so far beyond their understanding. But then I started to see it. The same deception I had witnessed in the vision, working right in front of me. Friends who had once been strong in their faith looked at me with pity, as if I had suffered some kind of brain damage. Maybe it was just a dream, Daniel, they'd say. Your mind trying to make sense of the trauma. Others, even some from my own church, told me to keep quiet. People won't understand, they warned. You don't want to scare them away. Scare them away, I wanted to shake them to make them see. That's exactly what the enemy wanted, to keep people comfortable, lulled into complacency, blind to the battle raging around them. I thought about the vision of the future I had been shown, the way faith had been watered down, reshaped into something easy, something palatable. And now, I was seeing it unfold in real time. The world was already being primed for what was coming. I tried to tell Sarah. At first she listened, her brows furrowing in concern as I described the war beyond the veil, the deception spreading like a slow poison. But the more I spoke, the more I saw the doubt creep into her eyes. "Daniel," she said gently one night as we lay in bed. "Maybe it was real to you, but how do you know it wasn't just a vision meant for you alone? Maybe you're not supposed to warn people. Maybe it was just for your faith." No, that wasn't what he told me. I could still feel the urgency in Jesus' voice. Even the faithful will be tested. I sat up, running a hand through my hair. "Sarah, you don't understand. It's already happening. Look at the world. Look at how easily people believe lies, how quickly truth is being reshaped," she sighed, reaching for my hand. "I believe you saw something, I do." "But," her voice trailed off, hesitant, "Daniel, I need my husband back. You almost died. I thought I lost you. And now you're obsessed with this." The word stung. I opened my mouth to argue, but then I saw it, the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear, not of what I was saying, but of losing me again. So I stopped, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because I realized something else. The deception wasn't just in the world, it was personal. It was in our homes, our relationships, our fears. It was in the way doubt crept in through the ones we loved, the way silence was forced not by violence, but by concern, by pressure to move on. The enemy didn't need to take my life. He just needed to make me afraid to speak. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Jesus had spoken to me. I had asked him, "What do I do?" And he had answered, "Tell them, not convince them, not force them, just tell them," because the truth had power, even if no one wanted to hear it. The weight of silence became unbearable. I had returned to this world with a message burning inside me, but no one wanted to hear it. The few who did quickly brushed it aside, rationalized it away, or worse, treated me like I was broken. But I wasn't broken. I was awake. The days passed, then weeks. My body healed faster than expected, another miracle the doctors couldn't explain. But my soul was restless. I saw the world differently now. The news, the entertainment, the conversations happening around me, it was all so clear. The battle I had witnessed wasn't just some distant, unseen war. It was everywhere, woven into daily life, and no one saw it. One night, unable to sleep, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky a deep, endless black speckled with stars. A sense of loneliness settled over me, not just because Sarah didn't understand, not just because the world wanted me to stay quiet, but because I now knew something that most people would never believe. I whispered into the night, "God, what do I do?" The silence stretched. Then a thought, not my own, but something deeper, something pressing into my spirit. Truth doesn't need permission to be spoken. I inhaled sharply. The enemy's greatest weapon wasn't violence. It wasn't chaos. It was silence. That was how he had won so many battles, by making truth seem like an opinion, by making those who spoke it seem radical or delusional. If he could make the faithful afraid to speak, he didn't need to destroy them. They would destroy themselves, one compromise at a time. I clenched my fists. I had seen what was coming. I had been shown what was coming. And I had been given a simple command, tell them. I didn't need to be understood. I didn't need to be believed. I just needed to speak. The next morning I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop and began to write. Not a polished sermon. Not a carefully worded argument designed to persuade skeptics. Just the truth. I wrote about the battle beyond the veil, about the deception creeping into the world like fog, so slow and subtle that most wouldn't notice until it was too late. I wrote about what I had seen, the slow erosion of faith, the churches that had traded truth for comfort, the world that no longer recognized the difference between light and darkness. I poured everything onto the page. When I finished, my hands trembled over the keyboard. I hesitated only a moment before I pressed publish. Then I waited, at first nothing. Then the comments started. Some were encouraging, others dismissive. Some accused me of lying, of seeking attention. Others told me I was fear-mongering, that God wouldn't show something so negative to someone like me. But then there were the others, the ones who whispered, "I've seen it too." People who had experienced dreams, visions, warnings. People who had felt the shift in the world but had been too afraid to speak. I wasn't alone. The battle wasn't just mine. And maybe, just maybe, the awakening had already begun. The floodgates had opened. At first, it was just a handful of people reaching out, sharing their own experiences. Dreams of darkness creeping over cities, feelings of urgency they couldn't explain, visions of battles raging beyond sight. But soon, the numbers grew. Messages poured in from strangers, from pastors, from people who had never been particularly religious but now felt something shifting, something coming. I had spent weeks believing I was alone, that no one would understand. But now I saw the truth. Others had been warned too. The deception wasn't just beginning, it had been underway for years, decades, and only now were people starting to wake up. But with the messages of support came the attacks. They started subtly at first, skeptical comments, condescending emails. But then the hostility grew. People called me a liar, a false prophet. Some accused me of fear-mongering, twisting faith into paranoia. Others sent messages so filled with venom I could feel the darkness behind them. And then came the threats. I found them in my inbox, on my social media, even in my mailbox. Some were anonymous. Others had names attached, people emboldened by their belief that I was dangerous. "Shut up, you're scaring people. If you keep talking, you'll regret it." One message chilled me more than the others. It was a simple sentence, no sender name, no context, just 7 words. "You are not supposed to remember this." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I knew without a doubt that this wasn't just from some internet troll. This was something else, something watching, something trying to make me stop. I closed my laptop and sat there in silence, my mind racing. The warning Jesus had given me echoed in my thoughts. Even the faithful will be tested. This was the test, wasn't it? The enemy wasn't just working through deception. He was working through fear, through intimidation, through the slow, insidious whisper that it would be easier to just stay quiet. I ran a hand through my hair and exhaled shakily. I had a choice. I could listen to the fear. I could let the threats, the doubt, the isolation wear me down until I became just another voice swallowed by the noise, or I could keep speaking. I stood, walked to the window and looked out into the night. The world outside seemed normal, unchanged, but I knew better now. I had seen what was beneath the surface, and I wasn't backing down. I whispered, "I will not be silent." A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from certainty. The battle was here, and I was ready. The days that followed tested me in ways I never expected. At first it was just the messages, the threats, the accusations, the people telling me I was delusional. But then strange things started happening. My emails would disappear. Posts I had written would be deleted without explanation. Some of the people who had reached out to me, those who had shared similar visions, suddenly went silent. I would check their profiles, their accounts, and it was as if they had never existed. And then the shadows came. It started with a feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck when I was alone, the weight of unseen eyes watching me from corners just beyond my vision. I would turn, expecting to find someone there, only to be met with empty space. but I knew I wasn't imagining it. One night, as I drove home from a late church meeting, my headlights flickered, just for a moment. A second later, the radio cut out, replaced by static. Then a voice, not human, not mechanical, something else, stopped speaking. My hands tightened on the wheel. My breath came short and fast. The voice wasn't loud, but it pressed against my mind, sinking into my bones like ice. And then it was gone. The radio crackled back to life. My headlights steadied, but my body trembled. I pulled over to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had known there would be opposition. I had expected ridicule, expected disbelief. But this was something else. This was war. I squeezed my eyes shut and whispered, "Jesus, what do I do?" And then peace, not a word, not a vision, just a presence, steady and unshakable. Like a hand on my shoulder, a whisper of warmth cutting through the cold. I knew the answer. The enemy wanted fear, wanted silence. I would give him neither. I took a deep breath, started the car again, and drove home. But I didn't go to bed that night. Instead, I wrote. I told the world everything. I wrote about the voice on the radio, the threats, the darkness pressing in. I described it all, knowing that the more I exposed it, the less power it had. Because that was the secret, wasn't it? The enemy didn't thrive in battle. He thrived in the hidden, in the unspoken, in the places where fear made people turn away. So I shined a light into the darkness, and as I hit publish, I whispered the words again. I will not be silent. And somewhere beyond the veil, I felt the battle shift. The night after I published my testimony, the air in my house felt different, heavier, charged with something unseen. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise sharper. It wasn't paranoia. It was presence. Something knew what I had done. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heartbeat slow but forceful. My body was exhausted, but my mind was on fire. I had exposed something, ripped the mask off a deception that had been working in silence for far too long, and now it was looking back at me. Sometime past midnight, I drifted into uneasy sleep. It didn't last long. I woke to a sound, a whisper, not a word, not even a voice, just a movement of sound like wind sliding through the cracks of an unseen door. It slithered along the edge of my hearing, just enough to send ice through my veins. I turned onto my side, forcing slow, steady breaths, and then I felt it, something in the room with me. The air thickened, pressing down on my chest like an unseen weight. Every hair on my body stood on end. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. Because I wasn't just being watched, I was being studied. A predator gauging its prey. I squeezed my eyes shut, not in fear but in focus, and then I spoke, not loudly, not in panic, just firm, unshaken. "In the name of Jesus Christ, leave." Silence. The air shuddered. Not physically but spiritually. I felt the tremor, like a ripple through unseen waters. Then the weight lifted. The presence recoiled, pulling back, not gone but pushed back. I exhaled sharply, my pulse still hammering. I knew what had happened. It had come to intimidate me, to make me question, to make me hesitate, and it had failed. I sat up slowly, rubbing my hands over my face. Sleep was no longer an option. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and reached for my Bible. Flipping it open, my eyes landed on Ephesians 6:12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. I exhaled, gripping the pages between my fingers. I had read those words before, 1,000 times. But now I understood them. This battle was real, more real than anything I had ever known, and I was in the middle of it. I whispered a prayer, not of fear but of authority. Then I picked up my phone. I had more to say. The next morning I braced myself before checking my messages. Every time I shared what was happening, there was pushback, sometimes from skeptics, sometimes from something darker. But I wasn't backing down. As expected, my inbox was full. Some messages were from people who had been following my journey, thanking me for speaking up. Others were less kind, accusations, warnings, mockery, and then there were the ones that made my blood run cold. You're being watched. You don't know who you're messing with. You think words will protect you. I set my phone down, rubbing my temples. It would be easy to dismiss them as empty threats, but I knew better now. The real battle wasn't waged with weapons. It was waged through fear, through silence, through doubt, and I refused to be silent. I spent the next few hours responding to the messages that mattered, the ones from people who had experienced similar things, who had been afraid to speak. Some had seen shadows in their rooms at night. Some had heard voices telling them to stop praying. Others had seen things in dreams that they didn't understand. They were waking up. The world was waking up, and I knew this was why I had been sent back. Not to keep silent, not to be afraid, but to prepare. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. Everything looked the same. The sun shining through the trees, the distant hum of cars on the road. But I wasn't the same. A shift was coming. I could feel it. And for the first time since my near-death experience, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. That night, I felt the shift. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no sudden crash, no flickering lights, no disembodied voices whispering threats. It was something deeper, something underneath reality, like the moment before a storm when the air turns thick and charged, when the world seems to hold its breath. I could feel it. Something was coming. I sat at my desk, scrolling through the messages again. More and more people were waking up, sharing their experiences, their warnings. But mixed in with their stories were others, people who had started speaking out but had suddenly gone silent. Accounts deleted, posts vanished. Some who had messaged me before were now unreachable. It was as if something or someone was wiping them away. The enemy was losing ground, and he didn't like it. A deep unease settled in my chest, but I refused to let it take root. I opened my Bible, running my fingers over the familiar pages. I didn't need to flip to a specific verse. I just needed the weight of it in my hands, the reminder that no matter how dark the battle, I was not alone. And then my phone vibrated. A new message. At first glance, it looked like all the others, anonymous, short. But when I read it, a chill ran down my spine. You were warned. A pause. Then another vibration. Last chance. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in slow, deliberate beats. Who was this? Another person trying to scare me? Or was it something else? I took a breath and typed back 2 words. Not afraid. I hit send. A moment later, the lights flickered. Then the power cut out completely. The house plunged into darkness. The hum of appliances silenced, leaving only the distant sounds of the outside world. A car passing in the distance. The rustle of wind through the trees, and something else. A whisper, not outside, not from my phone, inside. I turned slowly. The room was pitch black, but I felt it. That same oppressive presence from before, but stronger now. Closer. I reached for my Bible, gripping it tightly. You have no power here, I said, my voice steady. The air thickened, pressing against me like unseen hands. A slow exhale, not mine. Something was in the room with me. But this time I wasn't just reacting. This time I was ready. In the name of Jesus Christ, I said firmly, standing from my chair. You will leave. A low, vibrating pressure filled the air like sound without noise, a force without form. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it lifted. The lights flickered back on. The hum of the fridge returned. The house settled, normal once more, but I knew the battle wasn't over. This wasn't just about me anymore. It never had been. The deception was spreading. The battle was intensifying, and I had been sent back for a reason. I sat back down, reopened my laptop, and started typing, not just for me. For everyone who needed to see the truth. The days that followed felt like a fever dream. My life had become a blur of messages, prayers, and moments of intense clarity. I no longer slept for long stretches. Only catnaps between bursts of writing, answering calls, and responding to the growing number of people who had reached out. Some wanted answers. Some wanted reassurance. Others were simply seeking connection, knowing they weren't alone in feeling the weight of the world shifting beneath their feet. But as the messages poured in, so did the threats. They escalated. It started with small disruptions. A text message that came through from a number I didn't recognize, the screen filled with nothing but random symbols. The next night my phone rang, but no one spoke when I picked up. Just a low, guttural hum in my ear before it abruptly disconnected. And then it got worse. It was 3 a.m. when the first real attack happened. I woke to a sharp, hollow sound, a crash from downstairs as though something heavy had fallen. My heart raced as I sat up, clutching my chest. The house was dark, quiet, too quiet. I crept to the stairs, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't shake. Was it a break-in? A nightmare coming to life? But when I reached the landing, there was nothing. Nothing but the faintest trace of movement. A shadow. It was impossible to describe this shadow. It was as though the darkness itself had moved, shifted in a way that didn't belong in the real world. I stood frozen, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly. A figure, not human, looming at the far end of the hallway just beyond the threshold of the kitchen. I barely breathed, and then it whispered, "You don't know what you're doing." My heart seemed to stop in my chest. The air was heavy again, thick with that same pressure I had felt before. I didn't hesitate. I raised my hand, my voice unwavering, and spoke the only words I knew would shield me. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. The shadow stayed in place, an oppressive presence filling the room. And then, suddenly, it recoiled as though it had been struck by something unseen. It faded, dissolving into the air, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace of cold that quickly evaporated. I stood there, breathless, my body shaking as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. That wasn't just a shadow. That wasn't just a trick of light or my imagination. That was the enemy. I sank to my knees, heart pounding in my chest. I felt drained, as if I had just fought a battle I didn't understand, a battle I couldn't win on my own. And yet, something deeper than fear filled me, a quiet, relentless strength. The enemy wanted to silence me. He wanted to make me doubt, make me run away from the mission I had been given. But I wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't go anywhere. I had seen the truth. I had felt the battle. And now there was no turning back. I pulled myself up from the floor, my legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the window. The night was silent, the only sound the rustling of the trees outside. It was peaceful, serene. Yet I knew better now. This world was not what it seemed. I closed my eyes, steadying myself. There was work to do. A new urgency had taken root in my soul. I wasn't just sharing a warning anymore. I was preparing people. I was arming them. This wasn't just about my experience anymore. This was about all of us, and I would fight, whatever the cost. I took one final, deep breath, and then I typed again. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and long days spent writing and speaking to those who had reached out to me. Some came with fear, some with hope, and some with anger. But what I noticed more than anything was the growing sense of urgency that connected us all. We were no longer just talking about vague fears. We were speaking in the language of knowing. We all knew something was wrong, but we also knew that something greater was coming. It was as if the veil between our world and the spiritual realm was growing thinner, and the tension was palpable. The enemy was losing his grip, but in his desperation, he was fighting harder than ever. At times, the onslaught of messages felt suffocating. The questions piled up. Why was this happening? What did it mean? How could we prepare? And I had to be honest with them. I didn't have all the answers. I wasn't given a roadmap. All I knew was that the battle was real, that the forces at play were greater than anything I had imagined, and that we were in it together. That was the one thing I could cling to in those moments of doubt. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. But even as I answered questions and shared the message I had been given, something inside me began to change. The weight of the truth I was carrying was starting to take its toll. It wasn't the fear that had crept into my life or the threats that were sent to intimidate me. It was the burden of knowing what was at stake. There were so many people who still didn't understand, who were still asleep, who couldn't see the battle for what it was. And no matter how much I wrote, how many voices I tried to raise, I knew I was only reaching a small fraction of those who needed to hear the truth. One night, after yet another wave of messages filled with doubt and confusion, I found myself sitting in front of my computer, staring blankly at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keys, but the words wouldn't come. The weight was too much. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream the truth from the rooftops, but the fatigue was catching up with me. The doubt whispered louder than ever. "Who am I to carry this message?" I whispered to myself. "Who am I to lead this fight?" And that's when it happened. The voice. It wasn't like the whispers of the enemy. It wasn't cold or menacing. It was warm, familiar, comforting, as if a hand had gently placed itself on my shoulder. "You were chosen," the voice said. "You are not alone in this battle. The work you are doing is greater than you can see. Keep going. I am with you." It was the same voice I had heard during my NDE, the same voice that had calmed my soul, the same voice that had given me strength when I had no strength left to give. I let out a shaky breath, feeling the tears I had been holding back finally slip free. The weight didn't disappear, but the burden lightened. The doubt faded, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't in this alone, and the message was bigger than me, bigger than any one of us. For the first time in weeks, I felt the spark of hope flicker back to life. Not because I had the answers or because the enemy had stopped fighting, but because I knew the truth, and I knew that truth would stand, no matter how hard the battle raged. I opened my laptop again, and this time the words flowed. I didn't need to try so hard to force them into existence. They came, and they came quickly, as if they had been waiting for me to stop second-guessing myself and just trust. "This is what I've seen," I typed. "This is what I know. The battle is real, and it's not just happening in the world around us. It's happening within us, too. We are being tested, and we are being called to stand firm in faith, in truth, in love. It will not be easy, and it will not be comfortable. But we were never promised comfort. We were promised that He would be with us every step of the way." I paused, reading over the words I had just written. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace settle into my soul. I wasn't carrying this message alone, and I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to keep walking in faith, one step at a time. I hit send. And then, as if the weight had been fully lifted, I allowed myself to close my eyes and rest. Not for long, but long enough to remember that even in the midst of war, there was peace to be found. There was rest in knowing that I wasn't the one fighting. I was simply the messenger. The battle had already been won, and all I had to do was stand firm, speak the truth, and trust that He would handle the rest. It was a few days later when I received the call. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, just another routine conversation. But as soon as I picked up the phone, I could tell something was different. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the tone was urgent. "Are you sitting down?" the voice asked. I was. And yet I still felt my heart race in a way I couldn't explain. "Something is happening," the voice continued. "Something bigger than we realized. The enemy is moving in ways we don't fully understand yet, and people are starting to disappear. It's as if they've vanished from the earth. No trace, no explanation." I listened, trying to process the gravity of what was being said. My mind went back to the vision I had seen during my near-death experience. The darkness, the confusion, the feeling of a hidden war that was unfolding in the spirit realm. "Who's disappearing?" I finally managed to ask. Those who have been awakened, the voice replied. Those who have begun speaking out, those who are fighting back against the lies, against the fear, against the deception. They're being taken and we can't find them. No one can. My chest tightened. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone target those who were fighting for truth? The enemy had already shown his hand to me. He was afraid, and fear made him desperate. Where are they being taken? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The answer came slowly, a whisper of its own, but one that sent a chill through my bones. I don't know, but they're going somewhere, and they're being kept there, silent. I closed my eyes, a deep sense of foreboding weighing on me. This was bigger than I thought. The spiritual war I had been shown wasn't just a fight for control over hearts and minds. It was a battle for voices, for the truth. And that truth was being smothered. I had known, somewhere deep down, that there would be a cost. There always is when you speak out, when you fight back against the enemy's hold on this world. But now the reality of it was settling in, and it was heavier than I had imagined. What do we do? I asked, my voice breaking. The voice on the other end was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the hesitation, the weight of the uncertainty. Then finally the response came. We keep going, we keep speaking, we fight with everything we have, and we pray. A shiver ran through me. I didn't want to hear it, I wanted answers, I wanted plans. But deep down, I knew there was no other way. This wasn't a fight that could be won with logic or strategy. This was a battle that had been waging for longer than any of us realized, and the only weapon we had was the truth. You're not alone, the voice said again, almost as if reading my thoughts. None of us are, and we don't fight in vain. I closed my eyes again, taking in the weight of those words. They weren't just a reminder, they were a lifeline. The truth had been planted in my heart, and though the world seemed to be collapsing around me, it was still there. It was still powerful, and as long as I had breath, I would share it. The call ended. And in the quiet that followed, I sat in my chair, my thoughts swirling like a storm. The battle was intensifying. The enemy was becoming more desperate, but that only meant one thing. He knew something we didn't, and we had to be ready. I rose from my chair, feeling the resolve settle into my bones. The work wasn't done. I couldn't sit idly by, not now. The voices of those who had vanished, those who had been silenced, were still speaking, still calling us to stand firm, to fight, so I wrote. I shared the truth once more. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if the people who had vanished would ever be seen again. I didn't know if the darkness would retreat or grow stronger. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stop. The enemy may have been silencing voices, but as long as I had one, I would use it. And I would stand for truth, for justice, and for the light that would never go out. The war wasn't over, and I was ready to fight. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the weight of the message and the urgency behind it, please share it. There are voices that need to be heard, and the truth is a light that cannot be extinguished. Together, we can stand firm, speak the truth, and keep fighting for what is right, no matter the cost.